Hello folks, welcome back. This is Professor Watts again, and today we're going to talk about demand, supply, and equilibrium. So let's jump right in with the law of demand. Demand slopes down. It's really that simple. Technical definition, there's an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the quantity that people will buy, the quantity demanded. As the price of a good goes up, people buy less of it. It's a lower quantity purchased. And as the price goes down, people buy more of it. It's a higher quantity purchased. This is always the case. This is really the case for all goods at all times. Okay, so let's actually start drawing. I like to pick an actual product and an actual market area, even if it's a made-up area, as in this case. You'll notice that we have a fully specified demand situation here. So the product, the location, the price per unit, and the quantity per time period. And you really need all of these things to have a proper demand and supply diagram, but we have them all. And we'll just draw in kind of a generic downward sloping demand curve. And it's not important at this stage to have this exactly right, because we're just using the concept of demand and supply to think about, in general, price movements. Okay, and I'll give us a situation where price rises from $2.50 to $4, quantity declines from 10 to 8,000 gallons. That's the law of demand at work. As the price goes up, people buy less. Notice our terminology here. When price rose, what changed? Quantity. The quantity that people purchased declined from 10 to 8,000. We don't say demand changed. Demand is this demand curve. In fact, we should label it here, maybe something like demand 1. And that didn't change. That's still there. We just moved along that demand curve from point A to point B. Let's think about why we're making this move. Well, as the price goes up, we have substitution happening. People buy less of this good because it's too expensive, likely going to buy more of other goods. So they're substituting out of a more expensive good and into alternative goods. So we might be buying less milk, and with our grocery money, our food money, maybe we're buying more orange juice. Okay, so there's substitution as price increases. Now, let's think about the opposite case where price decreases. Now it goes from 4 to 250, and then the quantity goes up from 8 to 10,000 gallons per week. Again here, what happened to demand? As the price decreased, what happened to demand? Nothing happened to demand. The demand curve is still there, D1. What changed is the quantity, which went from 8 to 10,000. We went from point A on this demand curve to point B on this demand curve. This is the technical term for what's happening here is diminishing marginal value. As price decreases, extra units become less and less valuable. And you think about if milk were extremely cheap, if it were $1 a gallon, 50 cents, a dime a gallon, how much would you buy? Well, there's a finite amount. You'll notice that this demand curve is going to intersect the quantity axis at a price of 0. There's a finite amount of milk you can buy. There's a finite amount you can take home from the store. There's a finite amount you can store in your refrigerator. The biggest limiting factor is how much could you actually use. Nobody wants to drink 20 glasses of milk a day.
I see you're drinking 1%. Is that because you think you're fat? Because you're not. You could be drinking whole if you wanted to.
As price goes down, quantity increases, but only to a point. Extra units become less and less valuable. Okay, so there's a demand curve in the law of demand. Now let's talk about dynamics. A change in the price of a good does not change demand for that good. Price changes, as we just discussed, the quantity will go up and down along a given demand curve. Price changes, quantity changes. To change the entire demand curve, changing demand, we have to have something other than the price of this good shifting, and that's where we get into what's called determinants of demand. Okay, so first up is income. And there's two effects income can have. And for a normal good, as your income goes up, your demand goes up. And as your income goes down, your demand goes down. So a classic one might be cars. Now, you don't necessarily buy more cars, but you definitely will spend more on transportation. You'll spend more on your car as your income goes up. And there's a category called inferior goods, where as your income goes up, your demand actually goes down. And you can kind of think about here, it's kind of like a substitution out of an entire category of good, and you're shifting up to something that you perceive as better. There's a classic example of an inferior good. Normal and inferior are just category labels. They don't have any, we're not trying to say anything about people's choices. We don't do that in economics. Values are subjective, although we will comment on or maybe critique people's values from a standpoint of ethics or morals or the law. But from within pure economics, these are just kind of observational categories, no value judgment implied. Okay, so we have income. We have the price of other goods. The key word here is other goods. The price of the good itself changes. When the price of milk changed, what happened to demand? Nothing happened to demand, we just had a quantity change. But here, when the price of other goods change, that can influence the level of demand for a particular good. And that can be one of two categories. Substitutes, the price of X goes up, demand for Y goes up because Y is a substitute for X. So basically what we're saying here is that if X is getting more expensive and Y is a substitute, so I can use Y to satisfy the same kind of wants that X satisfies, well, I'll want to buy more Y because X is becoming more expensive. Likewise, if X gets cheaper, the price of X goes down. I'm less interested in Y as a substitute, so demand for Y goes down. Notice that direct relationship between price of one and demand for the other. Now here's an example, beef and chicken. The price of beef is rising, demand for chicken rises, or vice versa. If the price of chicken rises relative to beef, demand for beef rises. Goods could also be complements to each other. They go together. They're used together in consumption. So in this case, if the price of A rises, demand for B declines because you're using less A, the quantity demanded of A goes down. And if you're using less A, you're using less B because A and B are used together. Likewise, if the price of A goes down, demand for B goes up. Now your price of A goes down, people are consuming more of it, and they're going to go ahead and buy more B as well. Notice that now that we have an inverse relationship between the price of one and demand for the other. A classic example here, peanut butter and jelly often go together. So if peanut butter becomes less expensive, people will probably buy more of it, and then they'll probably buy some more jelly because they're going to be making some more PBJs. Here's a kind of a real life example of that, and this is something I observed several years ago. And don't get too excited about that gas price. It's not $1.70 per gallon. That's actually 1.7 Swiss francs per liter. This is over in Switzerland, and that works out roughly to $6 a gallon based on the exchange rate at the time. Europe has long had very expensive gas in comparison to the US, and most of that, frankly, is because they have really high taxes. But regardless, they have a very high gas price, $6 per gallon, and it's going to be something double, triple US gas prices. So go ahead and be an economist and make a prediction about how this is going to impact their consumption of related goods. Think about what kind of cars they're going to drive. Here's an example of a very small European car. And this one's an old one. This one's a 1950s one. So they've had high gas prices for a long time. They've driven small cars for a long time. Now, gas and cars are complements. So people are using less gasoline because the price is really high. They're probably going to be using fewer cars. And because small cars substitute for large cars, and it's expensive to operate large cars, they're probably going to be, of the cars they do operate, they're going to be smaller cars. It's a car I rented over there, smallest car I've ever driven. I had this thing up to about 100 miles an hour on the Autobahn. It was pretty exciting. And even at that, I was still being blown away by Mercedes and Audis and so on. So we've got income. We've got the price of other goods, substitutes, complements. Tastes and preferences. Taste and preference is really a catch-all category. We don't bother much with really trying to understand this. That's a matter for psychology. But we basically chalk up anything that's not one of the other determinants of demand. We can chalk that up to tastes and preferences. And I'll just give a quick example here based on musical taste changing over time. So this is something my grandparents' generation really grew up with and listened to. When I was a kid, this is what was popular at the time. Here's something that's popular now. God forbid my kids are listening to it. Here's something that was popular and remained popular, but then it had a sudden surge in its popularity and demand, and it was observable because of the unfortunate untimely death of Michael Jackson. So we actually observed that. Here's some news clippings I got from websites from right after he died unexpectedly back in '09. And you'll see that notes here that the demand source for Jackson music, Jackson items soar in value. Now what's going on? Well, we could say there's a pretty clear-cut shift in demand, and this is based on a change in tastes and preferences, and it's kind of based on this swelling of nostalgia for these items right after he died. Okay, let's say we're looking at the market for the genuine vintage albums, and we'll say that currently they're selling for about $10 each, and there's 500 a month changing hands. What happens after his sudden death increases the nostalgia? Well, there's a shift in demand, D2. So now the entire demand curve, notice, is at a higher level. And let's pause for a second to think about what that means. At any price, that means people will buy more than they previously bought. That's what higher demand means. So that at the old price, they might buy something like 1,000. Or at any quantity, they're willing to pay a higher price. So to buy 500 now, they'd be willing to pay $25 each. And I'm just making up the numbers. It's doesn't have to be very accurate at this point. It just has to reflect the actual pattern of change that we observed. And this is exactly what we did observe in these news stories here. Note that there's a fixed supply of the genuine vintage albums. You can't make more of those, so the supply curve is fixed here at 500. And therefore the adjustment has to be strictly a price adjustment. And we talk about new albums. New albums could be reproduced at a pretty constant marginal cost. So what we might see there is strictly an increase in quantity at the same price. Okay, expectations. estimation of the future value of a good changes, that shifts demand for the product today. It's a pretty observable phenomenon. Before, during, and after hurricanes, you see shifts of demand for certain articles that become extremely useful, both in preparing for a storm and cleaning up after a storm. Here's one. How about demand for ammo and canned food if we are expecting a zombie apocalypse? Well, if you really are expecting a zombie apocalypse, you know that when it hits, these goods will be scarce and hard to come by, so you want to stock up on them now, like this guy is doing. Okay, this guy's ready. This guy's going all out. I'm not too worried about this phenomenon, so I'm not investing a lot of money into canned food, ammo, and sleeping bags and such. I think it would be great if Jesus comes back the day before. This guy thinks the apocalypse is going to hit, and all this stockpile of produce will be worthless. But hey, at least he's putting his money where his mouth is, right? Okay, finally, the number of consumers. And this one's pretty straightforward. If you add consumers, if a population of your region grows, demand for products grows along with it. There's determinants of demand. Now, a little device to help you remember is I've rearranged the order a little bit, and you can see that you take the first letters here, and you've got a little acronym, determinants of demand. You can remember those through the acronym TYPE, T-I-P-E, number. So remember, type number is the determinants of demand. Tastes and preferences, incomes, price of other goods, expectations, number of consumers. Okay, let's move right along and talk about supply. Supply will be pretty easy to talk about if we understand demand dynamics. Supply dynamics are of the same sort. A supply curve shows the quantities offered by sellers at various prices. Supply typically slopes up. It's not always the case, but it typically does slope up due to increased marginal costs. Marginal costs typically rise with increased production in a fixed time period, in the short term. Now, there's an activity we do in class called the bread factory, and it's a simulation of production. And it's very simple because it only uses the chalkboard, and workers from the class, students. What we do is we only increase one input. We only increase the number of workers. We hold everything else constant. And what we see is that we can get more bread produced, but the extra production we get from adding extra students gets less and less and less. This is called diminishing marginal productivity. So because of this law of diminishing marginal product, if we have to pay extra workers the same fixed wage, but they provide less and less and less additional output, what that works out to is, in practice, is a higher and higher cost of producing extra units of the product in a short period of time. Now, if all of that flew past you, just remember that the supply curve slopes up. We actually calculate the results from the bread factory with some assumptions about the cost of the workers and the cost of the ingredients and so on, and we come up with some actual data. We graph out the cost curves and then the price line. The takeaway is, I'm going to produce bread, and we'll get into all this stuff here later on in the class, but I'm going to produce bread at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. That's going to be my profit maximizing level of output. And then to produce more bread, what's going to happen? Well, my costs are rising right here. So in order to produce more, I'm going to have that price rise. If the price rises, I will produce more. And if the price rises again, I will produce more. So my output is going to be governed by this rising cost curve. And the only way to get me to produce more bread is to have the price rise. So that constitutes the supply curve. Remember, the supply curve says how much producers will produce at various prices. I will produce more at higher prices because my costs are rising at the margin. Okay, so there's our upward sloping supply curve. Now the supply dynamics are going to be exactly parallel to demand dynamics. A change in the price of a good does not change supply. When the price changes, a quantity supply changes. In order for this whole supply curve to change, for that whole supply curve to move, we have to have a change in an underlying determinant of supply. So what are those determinants? Technology is a big one. In the bread factory, I will introduce a tool that allows students to double or triple their productivity. And what that means is that one worker who costs the same wage did not produce twice as much or 3 times as much output. Well, what's that doing to the cost of output per unit? It's slashing it in half maybe. So that would be shifting the supply curve down and to the right. Technology usually advances. So what that means is that technological innovations are typically making businesses more productive and pushing cost curves down, pushing supply curves to the right. Taxes and subsidies. A tax is just a cost of production, tax on producers. Just like the price of inputs. In the bread factory, we have to pay for the workers, we have to pay for the flour and the water, we have to pay for electricity, we have to pay for machinery. You have to pay rent, wages, interest on your asset inputs. You have to pay profit to the entrepreneurs. Taxes are kind of a cost of not being in jail, because if you don't pay the taxes, that's what happens to you. If you don't believe me, just ask Willie or Wesley. Wesley just got out of the federal prison a couple years ago. He was in there for not paying his taxes. That really impaired his ability to be in movies and earn money.
I've been caught already?
You got to pay those if you want to stay in production. So if the taxes go up, your costs go up, and your supply curve will shift to the left. Now, input cost is an obvious one. If the cost of flour or the workers rises for the bread factory, the company needs a higher price on bread to stay in business without losing money to cover its costs. And if those costs fall, bread factory can lower its prices to capture more market share. The number of producers, we add another bakery with identical costs, what would happen to the supply of bread? Well, it would be shifted to the right. It would be doubled. And finally, expectations. What happens to the number of people willing to produce bread at any price if everyone is expected to go on the Atkins diet? Now, the Atkins diet, you might be familiar with, is an all-protein, no-carbs diet. So if everybody really embraced this, what would happen to demand for bread? Well, demand for bread would disappear. But foreseeing that demand for bread is disappearing, what would bakery companies do? Would they continue operating? No, they would eventually have to shut down. So if this became a really big deal, I don't know how big a deal it is anymore, but if it did, that you'd see a decrease in demand for bread, and then you would consequently see a decrease in the supply of bread. Okay, so to summarize determinants of supply: technology, taxes, expectations, price of inputs, number of producers. We can use a similar kind of acronym here. Now it's TTEP number. TTEP number is a way to help you remember the categories for determinants of supply. All right, and now that brings us to equilibrium. We can put the demand curve and the supply curve together and talk about why a market will continually reach an equilibrium. What equilibrium is the price at which quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And take note of that. That's the definition of equilibrium. At the equilibrium price, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So note what's equal at equilibrium. Do not say price and quantity. It's quantity demanded by buyers is equal to the quantity supplied by suppliers. And that's important because we'll see here in a second that if we're out of equilibrium, bad things happen. Fortunately, all it takes to get to equilibrium is a free market. There's no legal restriction to prevent buyers and sellers from making any deal they want at any price for any quantity. So basically the hallmark of a free market is that the price can change. There's no legal restriction on the price changing and then people reacting accordingly. Free markets will get to equilibrium, some quicker than others, but ultimately there'll be adjustment processes that happen. Now we'll focus on some markets that adjust pretty quickly here and that you probably observe probably almost on a daily basis and perhaps reaching a new equilibrium every day. Sometimes one equilibrium price will persist for a few days. Sometimes it's a new price every day. And that is the gasoline market. So we just got a generic market for gasoline in Econville. Notice again we're specifying the price per unit, dollars per gallon, and units per time period. So I'm looking at a weekly basis here. We could look at a daily basis, a monthly basis. We just have to have some kind of fixed short-term time frame. We'll draw a generic downward sloping demand and a generic upward sloping supply. Again, the exact specification of these is not important. What we're interested in is making predictions about the pattern of change if supply and or demand curves shift. Let's start with an initial equilibrium price of $3 per gallon and quantity of 10,000 gallons per week. Now to think about why that's the persistent and dependable equilibrium, all we need to do is think about, well, what if the price is above equilibrium or below equilibrium? Let's start with above equilibrium. Imagine that everybody in Econville wakes up one day thinking that the price is 8. There's maybe some kind of computer glitch. This is the price that's displayed out on the sign at the gas station. So what's going to happen? Well, we want to take where that price meets the demand curve, so that's the quantity demanded at that price, and that where that price meets the supply curve, that's the quantity supplied at that price. And are those quantities equal? So is this an equilibrium? Buyers are buying less than they previously were. No, demand has not changed, but the quantity has gone down because of the higher price. Likewise, supply has not changed, but the quantity has gone up due to the higher price. So buyers are now only buying 3,000, and that means they're buying less. So what they're going to do less of low-valued uses of gasoline. So here the teenagers are probably going to spend less time cruising on Saturday night because they can't afford it. We're going to continue buying high-valued uses of gasoline. The ambulance crew is going to go ahead and bite the bullet and pay for this higher-priced gas because their use of gasoline is much higher value. And will they be able to pass along that higher gas price to their customers, their patients? Sure, it's not like we're going to say, if Grandpa's having a heart attack, we're not going to say, well, sorry, Gramps, the ambulance bills are really high now, so why don't you just take an aspirin? No, we'll pay a higher price, okay, to keep him alive. Suppliers likewise are going to be supplying a lot more, thinking that they can get more sales and cover rising costs and make more money. So they may be getting ready to supply 15,000. But is that going to be the case? No, because the quantity bought 3,000 is much less than the quantity sold up here at 15,000, and that gives us a surplus. Surplus is defined as quantity supplied exceeding quantity demanded at a given price. This is a key part of the definition of surplus here. At a given price, people are trying to sell more than people are willing to buy. Now, note that a surplus doesn't just mean that there's a lot of the product available relative to the past. The term for that is a glut. So you want to know the distinction between a glut and a surplus. A glut just means a large quantity, and a large quantity will bring low prices, and you still be in equilibrium. A surplus is very specific. It means people are trying to sell more than is being bought at the given price. Now, of course, there's a pretty easy mechanism to correct this. What's causing the surplus is that the price is too high, and there's a lot of disappointment here. All of these sellers here were accustomed to selling and now they aren't. These buyers here were accustomed to buying and now they aren't. These additional sellers thought they could sell at the high price, but they're not. So there's a lot of disappointment. So what's the correction for all of this? Well, it's of course to cut the prices and put the product on sale, so to speak. Inflatable Gorilla optional. Among the sellers who aren't selling anymore, who was most able to cut prices? Well, it would be the seller living down here on the supply curve with relatively low costs, especially compared to this really high non-equilibrium price. So notice that this seller right here, his costs are way below that high above equilibrium price. So this seller might be one of the first to offer a lower price, and then this buyer here, who's got a pretty high willingness to pay, not quite with this extreme of the non-equilibrium price, but nonetheless above the old price. So this buyer is willing to pay quite a bit more. He might take that offer. And notice now they're both happy. And we can repeat that process. Sellers whose costs are relatively low, selling to buyers whose valuations are relatively high. And that process gets repeated again and again and again until, guess what, we're back to equilibrium, and then the market will come to rest. And notice we won't do any more trades in this. We won't have a quantity above 10,000 because beyond that quantity, the cost of production, that's a supply curve, for any purchase exceeds the value to the consumers. And the demand curve can be properly thought of as the value curve. Then you'll see this. You'll see clearance sale, blowout sale, overstock sale. In some cases, businesses do mistakenly accumulate too much inventory, and it's pretty easy for them to get rid of it by putting it on a blowout kind of liquidation type sale. Now, in a what we call a thick market like gasoline, where there's millions and millions of gallons being bought every day, almost round the clock, those prices are going to adjust really quickly. Other kinds of markets, it takes longer for them to adjust. But ultimately, in a free market, the prices will adjust to get us at or keep us at equilibrium. Okay, and let's just quickly think about what happens if the price is below equilibrium. And let's say for some strange reason, everybody in Econville wakes up and the price is $1 a gallon. Pretty predictable what's going to happen, and then the adjustment process that'll be made. But let's walk through this. Now, all these people think they're going to be able to do more driving at this lower price. And so the teenagers are going to do more cruising, and people are going to maybe think about buying bigger cars, taking more road trips. So we're envisioning some more uses, and we're prospectively happy about buying more of the product. So now consumers are planning on buying 15,000 gallons per week. But now the producers, at a price of $1, they can only cover the costs for a small amount of gasoline. Remember, costs rise at the margin. The supply curve is the marginal cost curve. So these sellers had been selling, and now they can't. They're not going to give away gasoline for free. They've got to cover the costs. They can't cover the costs, so they're going to shut down. And what we get now is a shortage. People are trying to buy more than is being sold at a given price. And again, key part of the definition is at a given price. We're not just talking about a decline in the availability of a good. Normally in a free market, if there's less of a good available, the price goes up, people buy less, but it's still in equilibrium. This is a non-equilibrium situation. At this price, at this low, below equilibrium price, people are trying to buy more than is being offered. Well, there's a simple correction to this. And note, first off, though, that there's the unhappiness here extends all the way up to these buyers who were accustomed to buying, but now they can't buy because the quantity's been cut way back down here to 3,000. So we're going to turn these frowns upside down, and how can we do that? Well, there's some people here who are willing to pay more than this below equilibrium price, namely these people here. And the question is, can these people find deals with these sellers who would need higher prices for the good to go back into production? And can we have these transactions occur here between these buyers and sellers and get us back to equilibrium? Well, sure. Okay. And what we need is the price to be bid back up to equilibrium. Now, in some markets, you have buyers and sellers literally yelling their bids to the sellers kind of on a moment-by-moment basis. For example, you see this in commodities exchanges. But for our consumer products, we don't go in there and yell to the owner of the store that we're willing to pay a higher price. The store operator has to do that on our behalf. But I'm promising you that they will in order to avoid a shortage. So we might envision a buyer bidding up the price until we get back to equilibrium. It's not how it really happens. How it really happens is that the store manager, foreseeing a potential shortage, will go ahead and get the prices adjusted upward before it actually happens, and that keeps customers happy. So think about a real world situation. Walmart is big on low prices. Notice that's in their motto here. Always low prices. Always. Written in Sam Walton's blood. Okay, if the prices are too low, however, what might happen? They might have a whole bunch of customers come in and clean out the shelves, and then this is what's left. This is what happens when prices are too low. And I'll tell you that there's one thing consumers hate more than high prices, and that's not being able to buy the product at all. So it's actually very rare for Walmart to run out of anything. They have very excellent inventory management systems. That's one of their big competitive advantages. But if their costs go up, if the cost of cornflakes goes up because of a reduction in the supply of corn, and that increases the cost of making cornflakes, Walmart is going to have to some extent, pass that cost on to the consumers in the form of a higher price in order to keep an inventory of goods on the shelves, so when the customer walks in wanting to buy cornflakes, Walmart has it for that customer. So businesses will adjust the prices upward as needed to keep the market at equilibrium, to keep the goods on the shelves, to keep the consumers happy. Okay, and again, the process ends when we're back at equilibrium, because to have any more transactions, the cost of producing it exceeds the value to consumers. So we stop when we reach equilibrium, and we've kind of maximized the benefits we can get from producing and consuming this product. And that takes us to our conclusion. We'll talk about properties of equilibrium. Total surplus is maximized, and total surplus is just a way of visualizing the gains to buyers and sellers. And the distance between the demand curve, which is the value of the good, and the supply curve, which is the cost, is the net value. And we can't have more net value than when we're at equilibrium. In Econville, in either case, in our surplus case with an above equilibrium or our shortage case with below equilibrium, we had quantity reduced to 3,000, and total surplus then was reduced. We lost this whole area here of surplus, of gains, net gains for buyers and sellers, and those gains are destroyed if we're not at equilibrium. Only at equilibrium can we get all those gains. Total surplus is maximized, and the market is efficient. Efficiency means we're getting the most value for the least cost. And note that equilibrium divides the demand curve into two regions. We could call this kind of the high valued region here, high valued uses and low valued uses, and it divides the supply curve into two regions, so low cost and the high cost. Which ones are we actually going to undertake? Well, only the highest valued uses get accomplished, and only the lowest cost sources of the product get utilized. And remember back to Thomas Sowell's motto, we have scarce resources with alternative uses. Scarcity says we cannot fulfill all possible uses for a good. We need a mechanism that says yes to only certain uses and says no to all others, and that's what equilibrium market prices do. The market equilibrium says only these people up here get to buy, and only these people down here get to produce. Of course, your values are subjective, so can you become a high valued user if you change your mind about the value? Sure. So if you're down here on the demand curve, you can move yourself up here if you really want, if you're willing to pay that equilibrium price. And now equilibrium price becomes the gateway into accessing the good. And if a lot of people decide to value the good more highly, the demand curve shifts out, the equilibrium price rises. That pricing mechanism is an impersonal and very reliable and actually very effective mechanism for keeping the market in balance, for making sure that everyone who wants the good can get it if they're willing to pay the price. And as we'll look at here in the next several lessons, when we think about having prices for all goods across the entire economy, we have a very powerful tool to coordinate our actions and to have the economy function very smoothly.